Harry, one of the books that's clearly been most popular in the churches in recent years and also most controversial is the book of Revelation. In fact, at the time that the canon was being put together, some people wanted it in and some people wanted it out. And to this day, it stirs up both enthusiasm and problems wherever it's preached or taught. Tell us a little bit about the background out of which this book comes.
Right. The book of Revelation is, as the first word indicates, an apocalypse. That is an account of a visionary experience, whether that account is fictional or real. This is a literary type that we have in the first century in Jewish circles in particular. This book is coming out of a situation of intense stress among Christian communities in Asia Minor, what we now know as Asia Minor, the ancient Roman province of Asia. And it purports to be a series of visions seen by a fellow named John. And it's probably written sometime in the last 2 decades of the first century. We can talk a little bit more about its date. And it's written to encourage people who are in these Christian communities to resist the kinds of forces that are impinging on them, the political forces of the Roman Empire and their supporters, and to give them a message of consolation and hope that God has somehow overcome whatever powers of evil there are in the world, and that they, here and now, participate in the victory that God has won over those powers. That's basically what the book is trying to do.
Is the John who writes this any relation to the other Johns we have in the New Testament, or is it just another man by the same name, or do we have any sense of that?
Well, the tradition has it that the John who sees the visions of the book of Revelation is John the son of Zebedee, and that same tradition that we encounter from the 2nd century on suggests that he was the author of the fourth gospel, as well as the book of Revelation. Most contemporary scholars don't agree with that traditional judgment, largely on the basis of the style of the Greek in the book of Revelation, which is very, very different from what we have in the fourth gospel. So the most that we can say is that there's an elder named John who looks to the history of the church and to the community founded on 12 apostles, of which he apparently doesn't consider himself one, that had these visions and wrote this account.
Yeah. What's your sense of the possible time frame for the writing of Revelation? First century, any? I know that doesn't say here we are in 68 CE or AD, but any sense of when this might have been put together?
Right. The church fathers who talk about the book late in the 2nd century say that it was written under Domitian, the Roman emperor who was assassinated in 96. So that would give us, if that opinion is correct, it would give us a general frame of reference in those last 2 decades of the first century. There are some indications in the text that point to a more precise date. In chapter 17, there's a bit of a symbolic play on a city with 7 hills and 7 kings. And this seems to correlate with the Roman emperors in the first century. And the text says that there's 5 have fallen and 1 now is. So if that's the 6th in the sequence of Roman emperors, and if you start the count from Augustus, that puts us right at 68, 69, a year of 3 emperors, competing Roman generals who tried to seize power after the assassination of Nero in 68. It's possible that what we have there is an oracle or a text that was written during that time and then reused by the author of this text a little later. And what points in that direction is the identification of Rome as Babylon. A symbolic equation of the new imperial power with the power that had destroyed Israel and destroyed the first temple 600 years earlier. So that points to a dating of the book after 70 AD, when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by Roman forces.
We'll talk about this more as we go along, but any sense initially of what's the problem with the empire? I mean, it's strong and we're weak, but what are the Christians complaining about? What's John complaining about?
I think there were 2 or 3 major issues. The first is a traditional issue for people in the tradition of ancient Israel, and that is idolatry. When we come to chapters 12 and 13 in particular, we'll see that there's a complaint about the worship of Rome, the worship of the great beast. And sure enough, the cult of Rome and Augustus was a very important factor in civic life in those cities of Asia Minor. So idolatry is part of it, but it's also connected with the economic order. And so the people for whom this book were written were probably not in the 1% who were running the Roman Empire. Yeah. And they saw both religious and political and economic oppression coming from the people who were in control. And so those are the factors, I think, against which the book is protesting.
Yeah. One thing I note in reading it through is how deeply it's steeped in the Old Testament, how often it doesn't exactly quote, but does riffs, plays on familiar Old Testament stories and prophecies. What's your sense of the way in which this writer is indebted to the Old Testament and how it counts for him in his writing?
It's enormously important for understanding this book to see where the imagery is coming from and to read it in connection with the Old Testament text on which it quite clearly depends. And I think that's another indication that what we have here is not simply the record of a personal vision. It's a literary product that uses the device of visionary experience filtered through a reading of ancient texts. And we'll see this time and again that the author will take something from the book of Daniel or the book of Isaiah or the book of Ezekiel, reuse it and give it a new twist to try to apply it in some interesting way to his own situation. So he sees himself as part of the prophetic tradition. In fact, he says so in that opening paragraph where he defines the book in some ways as a revelation, but also as a word of prophecy. And prophecy for him means more telling what God's will is for the here and now than it is predicting the future. And he sees all of the prophets doing the same thing, and he hears the voice of God speaking to him now through those ancient prophetic texts.
So in the old line of Davy Napier, who taught me Old Testament 1,000 years ago, that the prophets are more about forth-telling than foretelling. What's going on? What's God doing? How do we understand that? Not so much what's going to happen in 1964 or Israel versus Palestine.
I think we have to distinguish a couple of major ways of reading the book of Revelation. And one is to take it as predictive prophecy. And you see a lot of that in popular literature about Revelation. And this interpretation takes it as a blueprint for our own time. And you constantly have people trying to read the signs of our times in the signs in the book of Revelation. That's been going on off and on throughout the course of Christian history, and there are different particular applications of that principle. I think the book of Revelation, though, is not so much interested in charting out the course of end-time events as in making a statement about what it means to be Christian in a situation of oppression. And seeing it as that kind of statement, a symbolic statement, a bit of symbolic poetry, if you will, is, I think, a much better way of understanding what's going on in the text.
Very helpful. Tell me a little bit about the way in which vision works. How is this a vision? How is he caught up in vision? What is John as a visionary?
Right. Again, this is something that's coming from the tradition of apocalyptic literature. And we have one other major example of this in the biblical canon, and that's the book of Daniel. Although we also have in prophetic texts reports about prophets seeing heavenly visions. Isaiah is caught up into the heavenly sanctuary and hears the holy, holy, holy. We'll see something similar to that going on in John 4. And Ezekiel, too, has visions of the temple and visions of a New Jerusalem, etc. So visionary experience is in part a reference to having some access to the presence of God and God's will for humankind, metaphorically described as a trip to heaven. What we also have is simply an elaborate use of images. Images coming from all sorts of places and put together in all sorts of curious ways. Beasts with 7 heads and 10 horns, etc. Surreal in many ways. And I think this is an effort to stimulate the imagination and to help people to see the reality of their own situation in a new way.
So again, in some ways, as with the temporal predictions, you don't want so much to figure out which horn is which or why the beast is wearing that particular, because it is in a way surreal. It liberates the imagination rather than kind of confining it. I think sometimes we read Revelation as a way to kind of constrain our vision of the future, and it really could be a way of liberating our vision of the present.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very helpful way.
So it start with 7 letters. We've said, okay, here's a vision. It's a visionary book. But right at the top sounds like the blessed St. Paul sitting down to write a bunch of letters. What's that about?
It's interesting that you mentioned Paul and his letters, because it may well be, and some people have suspected this, that the Pauline letter collection was already put together by this time, or at least one version of it, and that our John is in some ways responding to that fact and trying to do something similar. In any case, what he's addressing in those 7 letters after he sees a vision of the Son of Man, which is a really interesting initial vision, calling upon the book of Daniel and putting together 2 elements there.
Say a little about that. We'll come back to letters.
The elements in that first vision are this figure of the human being,
right.
the Son of Man from Daniel 7, which stands for, as Daniel tells us, the children of the saints of the Most High, i.e. the people of Israel. And in that scene in Daniel 7, the Son of Man is put into a throne. He's given celestial authority by someone called the Ancient of Days. And the features of the Ancient of Days are attributed to the Son of Man in John's vision. So he amalgamates the elements of the vision in Daniel in a way that suggests that he has a very high estimation of who this Son of Man is. It's clear that the Son of Man is Jesus. So Jesus is in some sense divine from the get-go. And it's Jesus who's the source of the messages that are given by the text here through angels to the 7 churches. The formal literary feature is that the messages are given by these angels, okay? Or given to these angels, to these angels for the churches.
For the churches,
in any case, each of these messages says something about the Christian communities in Asia Minor. And they suggest that these are communities in tension with other religious bodies. They talk about, for instance, the synagogue of Satan, probably a Jewish group not far away. And I think this author thinks of himself as Jewish, too, very much. But the Jews down the street in the other synagogue don't believe in Jesus, and so they're inimical to this group. There are probably also some other Jesus followers that the author describes here as following false prophets, Jezebel or Balaam and Balak. And what they're accused of is eating meat sacrificed to idols and fornication. Fornication may have something to do with sexual activity, or it may be a metaphor for idolatry, as it is so often in the Old Testament. And the eating meat sacrificed to idols is an issue that we know of from 1 Corinthians. And it was something that divided the Christian community. Could you participate in cultic activity that was somehow associated with the religion of Greece and Rome? Were you compromising your Christian belief to do so? And Paul wrestles with that, and that community wrestles with it. Our author, I think, has a very clear understanding that you don't do that sort of thing.
It's always idolatry.
And he's probably in dialogue with people like the Christians in 1 Corinthians who saw no problem with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Harry, one of the things I noticed as you were talking about this vision of the Son of Man is that he carries so much of the power of the Ancient of Days. This does not look like the simple Jesus by the road of Galilee, on the roads of Galilee. What kind of sense of Jesus, what kind of sense of Christ is implied by this powerful Jesus who comes in the vision?
Right. Well, just to remember, I think that Jesus used the language of Son of Man about himself, and often it's used in a very simple and straightforward way to refer to himself as a human being. Unlike the foxes who have their dens, he has no place to lay his head. But then it's used in a very potent way, both in the end-time discourse of Mark 13 and in the trial scene of Mark 14, and in the parallels in the other synoptic Gospels. Jesus refers in chapter 13 to the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, which is clearly an allusion to Daniel, understanding the image of the Son of Man in Daniel as a reference to the coming of the Messiah at the end of time. coming of the Messiah in power and in glory. And then in the trial scene of Mark 14, he identifies himself with that coming Son of Man when he's asked if he's the Christ.
Right.
So the Son of Man comes to be used as a way of referring to Jesus in that status of eschatological glory and power that's expected by early Christians to inaugurate the coming of God's kingdom on earth.
And one of the interesting things as we go on through Revelation will be to see the way that that power remains, but the sense of who Christ is also is shifted and adumbrated in somewhat different ways.
Right. He's also the lamb that was slain and the lion.
Right. We look forward to it.